Okay, so think about really mastering a skill, something hands-on, like hospitality. You really need to get in there and actually do it right.
Absolutely. Practice is key.
But what happens when, setting up those real-world practice situations during training is just really difficult.
That's a fundamental issue. I mean, hospitality relies so much on people knowing the precise steps for things. That's the procedural know-how.
Right.
But it's also about thinking quickly, solving unexpected problems smoothly, an adaptive skill.
Exactly. And that's where our deep dive today gets really interesting. We're looking at a pretty fresh approach to training. One that mixes virtual reality with something maybe a bit more old school. Board games.
It sounds counterintuitive maybe, but yeah. We're basing this on a fascinating recent study.
Right, the source. It's a research paper, and the title is quite something.
It is. It's called A Multidimensional Scaffolding-Based Virtual Reality Educational Board Game Design Framework for Service Skills Training by Yu-Cheng Lin, Shuyan Chen, and Huiya Sahao.
Multidimensional Scaffolding-Based Virtual Reality Educational Board Game Design Framework. Okay. Let's try and break that down a bit.
Definitely.
Our mission today is really to get our heads around how this blend VR, board games, and this thing they call scaffolding.
Which is basically like layers of support built into the learning.
Right, exactly. How does all that actually affect how well students learn service skills? And, what about their mental effort? Does it make it harder?
Or easier.
Yeah.
And does it affect enjoyment, boredom, those emotional factors too?
Yeah, all of that. So the study kind of starts by pointing out the problems with traditional hospitality training.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Take internships, for instance. Great idea in theory, connecting the classroom to the real job.
Sure.
But sometimes there's a disconnect,
Yeah.
What the hotels actually need versus what the students are focused on learning. It doesn't always line up perfectly.
Right. And I guess that's partly why we're seeing more interest in simulated learning, like VR, especially now with contactless services becoming a bigger thing.
Precisely. The need for tech-integrated experiences is growing, and VR offers this really immersive way to practice different service scenarios.
Yeah.
Safely too. Without real-world consequences if you mess up.
Makes a lot of sense.
But what's really cool about this study is the framework they propose, this hybrid model.
The multidimensional scaffolding-based.
Yeah,
that one.
It doesn't just say use VR. It's about combining VR's strengths with what board games are good at.
Okay, so VR gives you the immersion, the feeling of being there, maybe some instant feedback.
Exactly. Real-time evaluation potential.
But what do the board games bring to the table then? Seems like a jump.
Well, think about playing a board game with others. It naturally sparks conversation, right? Collaboration.
Ah, okay. Face-to-face interaction.
Yes. Communication, teamwork, problem solving, together in a shared physical space. This framework uses both VR and the board game, supported by these different kinds of scaffolding.
Okay, so these support systems, the scaffolding, let's dig into those. What types are we talking about?
So the first one they mention is VR exploratory cognitive scaffolding,
Okay.
which basically means learners can just freely explore the VR scene, interact with things, get the lay of the land, gather information. It's like situational learning, finding things out for yourself in the environment.
Got it. So you kind of figure things out by looking around virtually. What's next?
Then there's peer scaffolding.
Yeah.
This is the learning that happens just from the players talking and working together during the board game part.
Right, the social learning aspect. People helping each other figure things out.
Exactly, learning from your peers.
Right.
Then number 3 is VR dynamic evaluation, metacognitive scaffolding.
Metacognitive. So thinking about your thinking.
Kind of, yeah. It's the real-time feedback you get in the VR environment after you do something. Like, okay, you completed the check-in task, here's how you did. It prompts reflection.
So it's not just practice, it's guided practice with feedback baked in.
Precisely. Then we shift to the board game elements for the next time. Card cognitive scaffolding.
Card cognitive, like info on the cards.
Yep. Information presented directly on the physical game cards. Things like action cards telling you the steps, task cards give you scenarios, even hint cards if you get stuck.
Okay, like little physical prompts and guides right there on the table.
And there's one more type linked to the cards, card metacognitive scaffolding.
Okay, another metacognitive one. How does that work with cards?
This involves players checking specific customer satisfaction cards in the game. It's another feedback loop, but within the board game structure, simulating guest reactions.
Ah, interesting. So you get feedback from the VR and from the board game itself, simulating different aspects.
Right, it's multi-layered.
Okay, so they built this really elaborate framework. How did they test it? Does it actually work better?
They ran a study, what's called a quasi-experimental study, basically comparing groups in a real classroom setting.
Not a perfect lab, but realistic.
Exactly. They had 90 university students, all studying leisure and hospitality.
90 students. And how did they split them up?
Into 3 groups. Group 1 was the hybrid learning group.
Yeah.
They got the full experience, the VR, the board game, all the scaffolding types we discussed.
A whole shebang.
Right. Group 2 was the board game learning group, just the physical board game, its cards, the peer interaction, no VR.
Okay.
And Group 3 was the VR learning group, only the VR environment, with its exploration and dynamic feedback, no board game.
Okay, so you can really compare board game versus VR versus both. What did the actual learning session look like?
It was structured.
Yeah.
Everyone did a pre-test first to gauge their baseline knowledge.
Makes sense.
Then they did the main activity, playing the game, or using the VR, depending on their group.
Right.
And finally, a post-test to measure learning gains. This test looked at 2 main things. Procedural knowledge, knowing the right steps in order.
Like how to check a guest in step by step.
Exactly. And contextual knowledge, applying that knowledge to solve problems in different situations, like handling a guest complaint.
Okay, so not just what to do, but when and how in context. Did they measure anything else, like how hard it was?
Yes, cognitive load, essentially the mental effort involved.
Oh, right.
They used a scale that splits it into 3 types. Intrinsic load, how hard the topic itself is.
Okay.
Extrinsic load, how much effort the design of the training adds. Is it confusing?
Right. Is the game itself hard to
And
understand?
germane load, this is the good kind.
Yeah.
The effort you put into actually processing and understanding the material. Deep learning.
Okay, that's a useful breakdown. And you mentioned emotions earlier.
Yep. They used an academic emotion questionnaire, focused on enjoyment and boredom.
When did they measure that?
3 times. Before they started, halfway through the game, and after the post-test.
Okay, so set it is clear. Groups, tests, measuring learning, effort, feelings. What did they find? What were the big results?
Well, the results for learning effectiveness were pretty clear-cut overall. The hybrid group, the ones using both VR and the board game,
Yeah.
they did significantly better than both the other groups.
Wow. Okay, so the combination really packed a punch.
It seems so. A clear win for the hybrid approach in overall learning.
What about those specific types of knowledge? Procedural versus contextual.
Good question. For procedural knowledge, knowing the steps again, the hybrid group came out on top. Better than the board game group and the VR group.
Okay.
But for contextual knowledge, that problem solving in different situations,
Yeah.
both the hybrid group and the VR-only group did significantly better than the board game-only group.
Ah, interesting. So the VR component, whether alone or combined, seems really important for understanding the context of service situations.
That's what it suggests, yeah.
Yeah.
The immersive aspect likely helps there.
Okay, now what about the mental effort, the cognitive load findings?
This was interesting too. First off, all 3 groups had pretty low extrinsic load.
Meaning the games in VR weren't confusingly designed?
Exactly. The way the information was presented wasn't a barrier for anyone, which is good design.
That's good.
And also encouraging, all 3 groups showed high levels of germane load.
The good kind of effort. They were all thinking hard and trying to learn.
Right. Everyone was mentally engaged in processing the material, regardless of the method.
But were there differences in, like, the overall difficulty, the intrinsic load?
Yes, one key difference there. The hybrid group reported a higher intrinsic cognitive load than the VR-only group.
Higher, so the combined approach felt harder.
A bit, yeah. The researchers think it might be because that group had to work harder mentally to integrate the information coming from 2 different places, the VR world and the physical board game.
Ah, okay, so you're juggling inputs from the virtual and the real. That makes sense. It might require a bit more mental bandwidth initially.
It seems plausible, but crucially, even with that slightly higher initial effort.
They still learn the most overall.
Exactly. So that extra mental work didn't seem to hurt learning, and maybe even help consolidate it better in the end.
Fascinating. And how did the emotions play out? Enjoyment, boredom.
Yeah, this adds another really interesting layer. The hybrid group reported significantly higher enjoyment, both midway through and after the activity, compared to how they felt before they started.
So they got more into it as they went along.
It seems like it. The enjoyment actually increased over time for them.
That's great. You want learners to be engaged. What about boredom?
Also a positive result for the hybrid group. They reported significantly lower boredom midway through the game compared to when they started.
So the variety kept things interesting.
That seems to be the implication, yeah. The mix of VR and board game activities might have helped stave off boredom more effectively than just doing one thing.
Okay, so pulling it all together, despite maybe requiring a bit more mental juggling at first, the hybrid approach seems to lead to better learning, and students enjoy it more and get less bored as they go.
That's the picture the data paints, yes.
So what's the big takeaway here? What does this mean for, say, designing training programs?
Well, I think it provides pretty strong evidence that combining VR and board games, especially this kind of deliberate, multi-layered support, the scaffolding, can be a really powerful strategy, particularly for practical service skills like in hospitality.
Yeah.
And it really highlights VR's strength in building that contextual understanding, feeling like you're in the situation.
And it also suggests that, a bit of initial cognitive effort isn't necessarily bad if it leads to better learning and engagement down the line.
Exactly. It's about designing experiences that balance that cognitive demand with engagement. It shows you can make something challenging but also enjoyable and effective.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it really feels like this research points towards the huge potential of these hybrid models, VR, board games, smart support systems. It seems like a more engaging and ultimately more effective way to build those crucial service skills compared to just sticking with the old ways.
Definitely. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How could these ideas translate elsewhere?
Yeah.
I mean, for you listening, how might these findings apply to learning other complex skills? Maybe things that involve procedures or customer interactions, but in totally different industries.
That's a great question. Could this blend of immersion, collaboration, and layered feedback work for, say, training technicians, or salespeople, or even healthcare professionals?
Worth thinking about. What elements could you borrow? The immersive practice, the peer discussion, the different feedback loops. How might that look in your own field or your own learning?
It definitely gives you food for thought. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of how to best combine these different learning tools, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This study feels like an important step, but likely just the start of figuring out how to really harness the power of blending the virtual and the physical for better learning. Lots more to explore there.